Well, aloha everyone, and welcome to a lecture on fluid homeostasis. So in your body right now, approximately 55 and 65% of your body mass is comprised of your body fluids. And these body fluids are present in two separate regions of your body. Basically, they're either found inside your cells or outside of your cells. And inside of your cells is going to be approximately 2/3 of the liquids in your body, and that's going to be the intracellular fluids. The extracellular fluids, approximately the 1/3 of that body fluid, is going to be comprised of two different types: the interstitial fluid, which is 80%, and blood plasma, which is 20%. Basically, what happens is we have an exchange of different ions back and forth between the blood plasma, the interstitial fluid, and the intracellular fluid. So in a female, we have approximately 45% solids and 55% fluids. In a male, that's 40% solids and 60% fluids. Of that fluid, again, 2/3 of that is intracellular fluid, so fluid that is actually inside the cells. And 1/3 of that is extracellular fluid. And extracellular fluid is comprised of two major types: interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that is found around the cells, but outside of the capillaries and blood supply, and 20% of that is found inside the blood plasma. Okay, so the plasma membrane of the cells is what's actually going to be the barrier separating the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell, and that's also going to separate the intracellular fluid from the interstitial fluid, which is the extracellular fluid, and it's going to do that by hydrophobic, hydrophilic interactions. And we also have a division from the blood plasma and the interstitial fluid by the blood vessel walls. Now, blood vessel walls get very thin at the capillary level, so capillary walls are much thinner than other blood vessel walls, and they're actually thin enough to allow exchange of water and other solutes between the blood plasma and the interstitial fluid. And this is very important because basically the blood plasma is a delivery system for nutrients that the cells might need, and also to pick up any of the extracellular waste that the cells might get rid of. So the blood plasma is constantly delivering groceries and picking up the trash. And it does that by dropping the groceries off with the interstitial fluid, which then takes it into, or right up next to, and delivers it to the intracellular fluid. So this is kind of what that looks like. So we have fluid exchange between the blood capillaries, so fluid in the blood plasma again leaks out of those blood capillaries and gets into the interstitial fluid, which is all of this region shown in blue. And then from there it's going to go into the cells, into the interstitial fluid, into the intracellular fluid, and it's going to deliver whatever nutrients need to go in. And then the cells are going to secrete any of their wastes from the intracellular fluid into the interstitial fluid, again shown in blue, which is then going to secrete those wastes into the blood capillaries, which are then going to take them out for disposal through, say, the kidneys or through respiration in the terms of carbon dioxide. So we have a constant exchange of water and solutes from these different fluid compartments. And we do that by the process of filtration, reabsorption, diffusion, and osmosis. And we've talked about several of these as we have gone through many different organ systems, but particularly when we talked about the kidneys. And we also have other inorganic compounds inside our body, including electrolytes, that are going to help regulate the fluid balance. And the body's going to bring water in and also secrete water out, and we try to make sure that water in is going to be equal to water out. The way that we gain water is going to be by ingestion, so we're going to be drinking water, but also the food that we eat is going to have water inside of it, right? If we are going to have things like lettuce, for example, it's going to have water inside those plant cells. We also are constantly creating water by way of metabolic pathways. So anabolism and catabolism are constantly happening. We are breaking down and building up molecules, bringing two together and breaking two apart over and over and over. Then doing all of these different pathways together, that's the process of metabolism, and that's constantly creating new water, right? We do that by a process of dehydration synthesis or hydrolysis to constantly be building these molecules up or breaking the molecules down. We're also going to be losing water, right? Again, we do that through different metabolic reactions, and we're going to lose that also through urination, perspiration, exhalation. So if you breathe on a cold window, for example, you'll be able to see those water droplets. And of course, although we do concentrate our feces, we end up with some water loss there as well. So this is just an overview of the amount of water that's brought in. So water gain on the left in blue versus water loss on the right in orange. So we're bringing in water from our ingested liquids mainly, and also our ingested foods, as well as I mentioned, most of the things that we eat are comprised of cells, and those cells themselves also have water inside of them. Additionally, we're constantly creating water during our metabolic processes, by which we are going through a process again called dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis, where we are constantly creating and breaking down water molecules in the process of metabolism. On the water loss side, mainly you're looking at the kidneys. So the kidneys are going to be secreting approximately 1,500 milliliters of liquid a day, which seems like a lot, but if you factor in the fact that kidneys are going to be filtering about 180 liters per day, and 178 and a half of it is going to end up back into your blood supply, it's actually a pretty high water retention rate. We also have water loss to the skin in the process of sweat, and also lungs through respiration, and additionally a little bit lost in the GI tract. Most of it is resorbed during the large intestines, but we do have some that is lost through fecal waste. Now, when we were talking about metabolic water is the process of creating water during the creation of or breakdown of molecules, and the amount of water that's formed is directly correlated with the amount of aerobic respiration that is occurring, specifically because every time that we create ATP through cellular respiration, we're also creating water molecules that are formed at the same time. So they are directly proportional. So the more aerobic respiration occurring, the more ATP production, also the amount of water formed is also increased during that same time frame. Okay, so what happens when you get thirsty, right? So if you have more water lost from your system than the water is coming into your system, you end up dehydrated. And dehydration is going to cause an increase in thirst. Okay, so here's what happens with dehydration. Dehydration has three major effects. First, we have a decreased flow of saliva, which results in a dry mouth and a dry pharynx. We also have an increased blood osmolarity, which then results in a stimulation of something called an osmoreceptor. So you may note that every single factor that we want to maintain in homeostatic balance has some sort of receptor. And blood osmolarity is no different. We have a specialized receptor called an osmoreceptor. It's in the hypothalamus, and it's going to detect an increase in blood osmolarity. If we have a decrease in blood volume, that's going to cause a decrease in blood pressure, which is going to act on the juxtaglomerular cells. These are found in your kidneys. That's going to increase the amount of renin that is released. An increased renin release is going to increase the amount of angiotensin II that is formed. And all three of these things, the dehydration including the decreased flow of saliva, the increase in blood osmolarity, creating the osmoreceptor stimulation in the hypothalamus, the decreased blood volume, ultimately ending in the increased angiotensin II formation, all of these are going to stimulate the thirst center in the hypothalamus, which, as you might guess, results in increased thirst. And if you are freely able to consume water, this generally results in an increased water intake, which then relieves the situation, increases your body water to normal levels, and is going to relieve your dehydration. It is said that by the time that you are actually feeling thirst, you've lost about 3% of your body's weight in water, not 3% of your body's water volume. So, for example, someone who is 200 pounds, by the time they are feeling thirsty, they've lost about 6 pounds worth of water. So that means that you actually do have to get to the point where you are fairly severely dehydrated before you feel like you have the urge to have a thirst reflex. All right, so we are also going to be eliminating excess body water through urine, right? And the amount of urine produced is directly related to the amount of water that is brought into the system. So if we need to conserve water because you're not bringing in enough water because you're dehydrated, you will end up with urine that is concentrated and very smaller volume. If you end up with more water in your system because you're drinking a lot of water that day, you will end up with dilute urine of a high volume. And the amount of water that's lost in the urine is actually directly related to the amount of salt that is lost in the urine. So the two main solutes in urine are going to be sodium ions and chloride ions. And it might seem counterintuitive, but wherever the solutes go, water follows, because that's kind of how osmosis works, is that the water also wants to reach equilibrium. It wants to have equal levels. And so if we have a higher solute concentration on one side, say we have 5% concentration on one side, that means we have 95% water on that side. So that means that if we have something that is 100% water on the other side, it wants to try to dilute that 95% out. So water is constantly going to be going to this region that has the higher solute concentration to try to reach equilibrium. So although it seems kind of counterintuitive, just understand that wherever the solutes go, the water is then going to follow by the process of osmosis, kind of automatically. Okay, so if we end up bringing in more sodium chloride, that's going to increase the amount of sodium chloride that's found in our blood plasma, which is going to mean that we have increased osmosis of water. In which direction? From the intracellular fluid into the interstitial fluid into the plasma. So we are pulling water across into the plasma because we've increased the sodium in the plasma, which means, again, the water follows. That's going to increase the blood volume. Increased blood volume is going to lead to the increased stretching of the atria of the heart. You may remember previously when we talked about the cardiac lecture that we have baroreceptors inside the heart. And these baroreceptors then react and lead to the release of ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide. At the same time, the increased blood volume is also going to decrease the amount of renin that is secreted. Remember, the juxtaglomerular cells that are in your kidneys are going to be responsible for renin secretion. So we're going to decrease the release of renin, which is then going to decrease formation of angiotensin II, because remember, these two go hand in hand. More renin, more angiotensin. Less renin, less angiotensin. So again, less renin, less angiotensin means that we're going to end up with less aldosterone release. And on the flip side of that coin, the increase in what's called the GFR, or the rate at which the glomerulus in the kidney is able to filter liquid from the blood to create the urine. All right? All of this is going to lead to a reduced reabsorption of sodium chloride in the kidneys, which is going to increase the amount of sodium and chloride in the urine. This is called natriosis. Something like that. It's going to increase the amount of sodium that's going to be lost to the urine, and it's also therefore going to be followed by more water being lost in the urine through osmosis. Remember, the water is going to follow the ions, and because we've lost more water to urine, that's going to decrease our blood volume. All right. We have three major hormones that are responsible for renal, so kidney retention or release of sodium and chloride. So we have angiotensin II, aldosterone, and atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. And you've heard of these before, particularly when we talked about the kidney or renal section. And the major one that we're going to talk about today is antidiuretic hormones, so ADH. And when you think about a diuretic, you think about something like coffee, right? Coffee ends up making you use the bathroom more because you end up with an increase in water loss. So diuretics mean that you lose water from your system. So if you think about an antidiuretic, it's going to help retain the water in your system. So an antidiuretic is going to help make sure that we are bringing more water back into our body and therefore secreting less water into the urine. All right, so this is just a summary of all of the different factors that are responsible for helping maintain water balance. The first is that thirst center there in the hypothalamus, which is going to be responsible for desire to drink fluids. And again, it's going to be pretty easily quenchable as long as water has gone into the body. Angiotensin II is going to be hand in hand with aldosterone. Remember, angiotensin II is going to be coming from increased renin from the kidneys. Anyway, angiotensin II is going to increase aldosterone, and that's going to promote the resorption of sodium and chloride, right? And when we resorb sodium and chloride, that means the water follows, so that's going to increase the water resorption through osmosis. Both of these, angiotensin II and aldosterone, are going to result in the reduced loss of water in the urine, i.e. the retention of more water in the body. ANP is going to do the opposite of that. ANP is going to promote natriosis, which is the increase in the secretion of sodium and chloride in the urine. And that elevated excretion of urinary sodium and chloride is then going to be accompanied by an elevated excretion of water, because again, water is going to follow wherever the ions go. So that's going to result in an increased loss of water in the urine. And obviously less water retention by the body. And ADH, again, antidiuretic hormone, so something that's going to be a water retention hormone. You also may know of this as vasopressin. It does something a little bit more selective. So it's going to insert or promote the insertion of something called aquaporins. So aquaporins are water channel proteins that are basically going to allow water to flood into or out of a cell through these specialized channels. And the specialized channels are going to be inserted into the principal cells in the collecting ducts of the kidneys. Remember, the collecting ducts are where the urine is going to travel into after the nephrons before reaching into the calyx and then heading off into the bladder or through the ureters into the bladder. Anyway, what's going to happen here is the increase of these cells, the increase of the aquaporins in these cells is going to increase the water permeability of these cells, means that we're going to be resorbing more body water, right? So we're going to be keeping more water in the body, and that's going to result in reducing the loss of water in the urine. Okay? Now, if you drink too much water too quickly, you can end up with something called water intoxication, which is actually extremely dangerous. So water intoxication happens when we have more water coming into the body than the kidneys are able to excrete. So we're bringing it in at a way faster rate, and the kidneys are able to excrete excess. And that's going to cause the cells of the body to swell dangerously. It can end up leading to coma and even death. And so it can happen for multiple different reasons, right? The first that we just talked about would be in the intake of water, just excess intake of water. But you can also have excessive blood loss, can cause this, or excessive sweating, excessive vomiting. So you can have water, you can have the loss of bodily fluids, which would be accompanied by the loss of sodium. Because basically what's going to happen here is you're going to end up with hyponatremia. And hyponatremia is when you have a decrease in the sodium concentration in the interstitial fluid and your blood plasma, which eventually leads to a decreased osmolarity of that interstitial fluid and that blood plasma, which then leads to the osmosis of water from the interstitial fluid into the intracellular fluid. And into the intracellular fluid means those cells don't have anywhere for that water to go. They're going to swell up like a balloon. This is going to actually be the process of water intoxication. And because of the way that it swells, you can end up with edema. You can end up with different pressure on, for example, nerves or blood supply, right, depending on where it ends up. So you can have convulsions and leading to eventually coma and possibly even death. So it's very important that you regulate the concentration not only of the water in your body, but also the different ions in your body, which brings me to my next point. So let's talk about electrolytes for a second. So what are electrolytes, right? You want to drink your Gatorade when you exercise or some sort of vitamin water that's going to end up replacing the electrolytes in your body. Why is that? So basically, when electrolytes dissociate and dissolve, they create these ions. And these ions are very important in regulating water exchange between the different fluid compartments, and also in regulating things like acid-base balance. Some of them are going to carry electrical current. Some of them also are going to serve as cofactors, which are going to be very important in different metabolic reactions. So they can be helpers to different enzymes or start/propagate different reactions that might not have gotten going on their own. And we express the concentration of ions in milliequivalents per liter, or MEQ per liter. And each of your different bodily fluids are going to have different concentrations of many different things, including protein ions and electrolytes. So your blood plasma, your intracellular fluid, and your interstitial fluid are all going to have variable concentrations of these different electrolytes. And again, this is very important because the point of this whole process of the fluid exchange is to make sure that your cells have the nutrients that they need and that their waste is carried out effectively. So they're not poisoning themselves by suffocating in their waste, and they're not starving in terms of what they need inside of their cell. And so we have to make sure that we have different concentrations of electrolytes and proteins and different gradients so that we are able to have exchange of material from the blood plasma to the interstitial fluid to the cytoplasmic fluid, which is inside the cell, and then also the exchange of the waste from the cytoplasmic fluid into the interstitial fluid and then back into the blood plasma. So we'll see in a second that blood plasma may be drastically different in terms of certain things like protein ions. For example, blood plasma has quite a lot of protein ions, whereas interstitial fluid contains only a few protein ions. So I don't expect you to memorize this table by any means, guys. I just want you to take a look and understand that if you look at the three different types of body fluids, the blood plasma, shown in red, the interstitial fluid, shown in blue, and the intracellular fluid, shown in yellow, you can see that if you look in terms of the different electrolytes, for example, sodium is going to have a much higher concentration in the plasma and interstitial fluid, so in those extracellular fluids, than it does in the intracellular fluid or the cytoplasmic fluid. However, something like potassium is found much more prevalently in much higher concentrations inside the cell than outside the cell. And so we have these gradients of these different essential ions from inside the cell to the interstitial fluid to the blood plasma, which allows for exchange of different nutrients across these concentration gradients. So it's actually very important, particularly when you're looking, for example, in the kidneys, we use a sodium transport system to be able to, again, draw the water back across to be able to conserve water. And so the concentration of these different ions in the different fluids is extremely important, or maybe not the concentration itself, but the concentration gradient, I should say, is extremely important. So some of the electrolytes that we're going to talk about in the next slides is going to include sodium. Sodium is a very abundant cation. It's found in the extracellular fluid. It's used in multiple different things, including the transmission of electronic impulses in your body, which are going to impede or create muscle contraction. It's also going to be involved in fluid and electrolyte balance, as I mentioned, in the kidneys in terms of secretion of water into the urine or retention of water. We also will talk about chloride, which is an anion. So cations attract anions. So cations are positive, anions are negative. This is the most prevalent extracellular anion, and it's going to help regulate osmotic pressure between the different compartments, right, inside the cell and outside of the cell. And then on the outside of the cell level, also between the capillary or the blood plasma and then the interstitial fluid. It's also going to be involved in digestion because it forms the HCl in the stomach through the gastric pits. It also is going to be involved in it is going to be controlled by aldosterone. So aldosterone is going to be involved in the regulation of chloride balance. So potassium is a very abundant cation, as well as the most abundant cation in the intracellular fluid. So inside the cell, it's going to be very important. It's involved in maintaining fluid volume. Also impulse conduction. So a lot of these are electrical. You'll see that positive and negative charges are going to be involved in all of the electricity in your body, which again, muscle contraction is an electrical event, and also involved in regulation of pH. And potassium levels are going to be regulated by mineralocorticoids, specifically aldosterone. Now, bicarbonate, you may recognize, is a very important molecule or ion in your blood plasma, and that's because it is actually the major player in the acid-base buffer system in your blood plasma. It's going to be resorbed or secreted by your kidneys to help maintain the acid-base balance of the plasma, which also is then going to affect the acid-base balance of the interstitial and the cytoplasmic fluids. Calcium, you may have talked about extensively. We talked about it when we did bones last semester, but we also talked about it when we talked about thyroid and parathyroid hormones, when we talked about the endocrine system. It is a structural component of the bones and the teeth, and is also involved in blood coagulation, involved in muscle tone, neurotransmitter release, and in your nerves and muscles. It is regulated again by parathyroid hormone, and again, you'll notice that we have an underlying theme here where a lot of these are involved in muscles and neurotransmission, nerves. So we'll see a little bit later on what happens if we end up with too many or too few of these ions in our system. Phosphate is generally going to be found as calcium phosphate salts. It's also going to be found in the buffer system. It's regulated also by parathyroid hormone and also something called calcitriol. Another important intracellular cation is magnesium. Magnesium is a cofactor that helps activate a lot of enzymes involved in metabolism, so involved in either the digestion or the creation of carbohydrates into simple sugars and vice versa, and also proteins back down into their amino acids and then vice versa. It's also involved in myocardial function. Again, you'll see muscles, in this case heart muscle specifically. It's also going to be involved in transmission through the central nervous system and is important in operation of the sodium pump. So, I just summarized a lot of different electrolytes and their regular roles. So now we're going to talk about imbalances. So on the left, you'll see the electrolytes, for example, sodium, chloride, potassium, and then we'll see what happens if we end up with a deficiency. That means anytime you see hypo, you have less of it. So, for example, hyponatremia, Na being the sodium. So anytime you see natremia, it's going to be referring to the concentration of sodium in the system, in this case hypo meaning too little. If we end up with excess, it's going to be hypernatremia, right? So all of the hypos, hyponatremia would be low sodium, hypochloremia, low chloride, hypokalemia, low potassium. The flip side of those coins would be hypernatremia, or excessive sodium, hyperchloremia, again excessive chloride, or hypokalemia, again excessive potassium. And you'll see that all of these, if you end up with too low, are going to end up demonstrating muscular problems, muscular weakness, muscle spasms, muscle fatigue, and we'll talk about them individually in a minute. But my point is that all of those ions are important for muscles and innervation. Okay, so let's start with sodium. So if we end up with too little sodium in our system, it's called hyponatremia. Hyponatremia can occur because we end up with a decreased sodium intake. Or we can end up with an increased sodium loss, right? It's all about balance. You could be taking the same amount in, but losing way more. And you can lose more through the loss of bodily fluids, like vomiting, diarrhea. But you can also have a hormonal imbalance, like an aldosterone deficiency, or you can be taking specific diuretics. So a specific diuretic might increase the amount of water that is lost by secreting more sodium, so that would end up with a sodium deficiency. And additionally, as we mentioned previously, with the water intoxication, this can also occur through excessive water intake. Some signs and symptoms of hyponatremia are going to include muscular weakness, dizziness, headaches, and hypotension. Again, we talked about a lot of different things that had to do with neurology. So we talked about nervous system and nervous innervation, and your brain is nothing but nervous system, right? We can also end up having issues with your cardiovascular system, so you can end up with tachycardia, we can end up in shock. Eventually this will lead to mental confusion because you're having an issue with your blood pressure and delivery of oxygen, as well as an issue with your brain function. So this can end up with mental confusion, eventually stupor, and coma in extensive cases. All right, so if we end up with too much sodium, this is called hypernatremia, and this is going to occur on the flip side of the coin. It can occur with severe dehydration. So if we end up losing a lot of water but still have a lot of sodium, we're going to increase the concentration of sodium. Water deprivation, which again will lead to dehydration, or if you end up increasing sodium in your diet. So if you eat way too much salt in your diet, or if you bring it in through intravenous fluid. So for example, if you were to run an IV pump that had way more salt than was necessary, you could end up causing what's called hypertonicity. And if that happens in your extracellular fluid, that's going to cause the water to be pulled out of the body cells into the extracellular fluid, which is going to cause cellular dehydration. So you're going to end up shriveling basically from the inside. Some signs and symptoms of hypernatremia include intense thirst, because you're going to want to get as much water in your body as possible. Because it could be caused by dehydration in the first place, but secondarily, more water means that you're going to be reducing the concentration of sodium in the system, so you're going to help bring these back into tolerable levels. It can also cause agitation, or like odd flickering of the nervous system, and then convulsions, because again, a lot of this has to do with innervation, and if we end up with too much of something that's involved in the nervous system, we can end up with dysregulation in the opposite direction. Okay, so let's talk about chloride for a second. So if we end up with too little chloride, again, hypo means low, we end up with hypochloremia. Hypochloremia can happen because we've lost our bodily fluids, so again, excessive vomiting, or also can happen because we have brought in too much pure water, so overhydration. Again, we can also have an issue with our hormones, like an aldosterone deficiency specifically, also something like congestive heart failure, and there's also certain diuretics that can cause this as well. Some signs and symptoms of hypochloremia are going to include, again, the muscle issues, so muscle spasms. We can also have metabolic alkalosis, so problems with your pH within your bodily fluids. Also shallow respirations, so breathing very, not taking deep breaths at all, hypotension, and then something called tetany. If we end up with too much chloride, we can end up with hyperchloremia. This can result also from dehydration. due to water loss or water deprivation, either way, also can occur due to excessive chloride intake. So if you just bring too much in, or also if you have severe renal failure, so your kidneys are just not able to adequately differentiate what's supposed to go into the urine and what's supposed to stay in the bodily fluids. And then hyperaldosteronism, which is basically the opposite of this aldosterone deficiency, when we have too much aldosterone in the system. Certain different types of acidosis, and also variable types of drugs. So what happens if we end up with too much chloride in our system? We end up very lethargic and very weak. We have acidosis, so our body is going to have acidic blood fluids and rapid but very deep inhalations and exhalations. All right, so let's talk about potassium next. If we end up with too little potassium, that's called hypokalemia. Again, this can also occur from excessive bodily fluid loss, such as vomiting or diarrhea, or decreased potassium intake, so you're just not bringing enough in. If we end up with hyperaldosteronism, again, we end up with an increase in aldosterone that can end up with a decrease in potassium. Different types of kidney disease can also do this, and also different diuretics. Some signs and symptoms of hypokalemia are going to include, again, we're hitting the muscles, we have muscle fatigue, we have paralysis, but flaccid paralysis, so not necessarily convulsive paralysis, mental confusion, increased urine output, shallow respirations, and then odd EKGs, including specifically the flattening of that T wave. If we end up with too much potassium in our system, that's called hyperkalemia. That can be due to excessive potassium intake. Again, we just take too much in. It can also be due to renal failure and aldosterone deficiency. However, it can also be due to certain types of crush injuries to specific bodily tissues, because you may notice that potassium is really high inside the body cells. And so if we crush a bunch of cells open at once, that can free the potassium from the cytoplasmic fluid into the interstitial fluid, so we can end up with way more potassium in there than is normally necessary. Or we can have that occur also from transfusion of blood that has been hemolyzed. So what if we have too much potassium? What does that look like? Irritability. A lot of times you get very sick, so nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Again, muscular weakness. This is really important. We want to regulate the amount of potassium in our system for our muscles to fire. So either too much or too little can end up with muscle fatigue and muscle weakness. And eventually we can end up causing death, because what's one of the biggest muscles in your body, you guys, right? Your heart. And so if we end up with issues with your heart contraction, we can go into ventricular fibrillation, which can end up causing death in the individual. So these electrolyte balances are very, very important. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of them one by one, but you can see here in this chart the different problems that can occur if you end up with too little. Hypocalcemia, too little calcium, hypophosphatemia, too little phosphate, hypomagnesemia, too little magnesium, etc. And then you can read over the signs and symptoms on your own. Okay, so let's talk about the acid-base balance in your body. So the pH of your arterial blood is normally from 7.35 to 7.45. Now that's pretty tight, you guys. And we have a lot of different buffers or mechanisms that maintain that pH range. So the first one are buffer systems, and these are super important. These are ways in which we can absorb extra hydrogen ions or secrete extra hydrogen ions if we end up too far in either way, either direction on the pH scale. But one thing that's often overlooked is that as we're actually exhaling carbon dioxide, we are also going to help change our bodily pH. So respiration is really important. And I know that we talked about this when we talked about the respiration section, how we can get respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, for example, if we end up not being able to have proper gas exchange. Also, the kidneys are responsible for excretion of hydrogen ions. So you might go, why do we keep coming back to hydrogen ions? And just to give you a quick basic biology lesson or chemistry lesson, I suppose, that's because pH is all about hydrogen ions, right? pH literally means concentration of hydrogen ions, and it's a logarithmic scale. So the lower that you get, it's going to, on the pH scale, you're going to end up with way more hydrogen ions, right? Like your acids. And then the higher that you get on the pH scale, you're going to end up with way lower hydrogen ions, right? That's going to be your bases. Okay, so how do we stay right there in the middle in that nice tight pH range? So we use several different buffer systems. One of them that we use is the protein buffer system, and you may notice when we talked about the difference between the blood plasma versus the intracellular fluid is that the protein is going to be much higher in the blood plasma than in, say, the cytoplasmic fluid, right? And this protein is going to be really important because as the pH increases, this guy here, this carboxyl group, can become a carboxylic acid pretty easily, and therefore it can free that hydrogen, right? So if we are going to, when we are increasing our pH, right, we're going too far towards the basic range, if we free up a hydrogen ion, now we can bring it back down towards the moderate, right? Because the hydrogen ion, the increase in hydrogen ion is going to bring us down to the lower pH. Okay, but as the pH goes too low, which means we have too many hydrogen ions in solution, the free amino group, which is on this side, right, is going to go ahead and absorb that hydrogen ion to become NH3. So it's basically effectively acting like a base to help bring that pH back up into that normal range. So the protein buffer system is going to help keep this pH within the appropriate range by acting like either a base or an acid, depending on whether or not we want to use the amino group or the carboxylic acid group. Another type of buffer in the red blood cells is going to be hemoglobin. So I know you think about hemoglobin as carrying oxygen, and that's true. That's what hemoglobin does. But hemoglobin also is able, when it's bound, so it's able to either bind oxygen or be reduced hemoglobin. And when it's not binding oxygen, it's able to bind the hydrogen ion. Okay, so let's start at the top here. So here we have water and carbon dioxide. These are going to be going into the red blood cells, and that's going to be creating a carbonic acid, right? Carbonic acid can be broken down into the hydrogen ion and the bicarbonate ion, and this system we're going to talk about pretty extensively in just a minute. So we'll talk about the bicarbonate buffer system shortly. And so we can also, however, in extreme measures, use the hemoglobin in our body to bind to that extra hydrogen ion, and therefore have a reduced hemoglobin, which can also help act as a buffer so we don't have too many or too few hydrogen ions in solution. So this is the one you're probably most familiar with if you've taken any sort of biology classes, even in high school. Is this carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. And basically what happens is we have a bicarbonate ion that's HCO3 negative, and that's going to act as a base in some cases, and also carbonic acid, well, not in some cases, bicarbonate acts as a weak base, and carbonic acid, which is the flip side of the coin, when it's picked up one more hydrogen ion, is going to act as a weak acid. So if the pH falls, the bicarbonate ion is going to remove extra hydrogen ions from solution and become carbonic acid. So remember, when the pH is falling, we're going to end up with extra hydrogen ions in solution. So when we're taking those extra hydrogen ions back out of solution and making them carbonic acid, well, now we are increasing our pH back up to whatever the regular levels are supposed to be. If the pH rises too far, carbonic acid, which is a weak acid, can actually release that hydrogen ion into solution, and bicarbonate ion is just going to have a negative charge, and therefore we're going to end up increasing the amount of hydrogen ions in solution, which is going to decrease the pH. So in this method, we're able to keep our blood pH within certain parameters simply by absorbing extra hydrogen ions and releasing extra hydrogen ions as needed. Another buffer system we have in our body is the phosphate buffer system. It's going to act very similar to what we just saw with the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, but basically instead of using carbonic acid and bicarbonate, we're using two other molecules, which are called dihydrogen phosphate, which is H2PO4 negative, and monohydrogen phosphate, HPO4 negative. And the difference between dihydrogen and monohydrogen is one hydrogen, right? We're going from two hydrogen to one hydrogen, and that means that we're able to release that hydrogen or pick that hydrogen up as necessary. And again, this is exactly everything that we're going to need as a buffer, is to be able to absorb or release that extra hydrogen into or out of solution. Okay, so here's monohydrogen phosphate. It's going to act as a weak base if we end up with too many hydrogen ions in solution, so that hydrogen ion is then going to get absorbed by that monohydrogen phosphate, turned into dihydrogen phosphate, which is actually a weak acid, but is going to help, instead of taking a strong acid, it's not going to be reduced to a weak acid, and so we're still going to help kind of soften the blow. in terms of the change to pH of the blood plasma. All right, so when we talked about the respiratory system, we went over this extensively, so you guys should understand this by now. But as we are exhaling our carbon dioxide, we are actually changing our blood pH, because in our normal blood levels, carbon dioxide is going to mix with water and form that carbonic acid that we talked about in terms of our carbonic acid buffer system. And so every time that we exhale carbon dioxide, we're going to produce less acid. Less acid means an increase in pH. However, if we hold on to more carbon dioxide, say we hold our breath or something has inhibited our ability to perform gas exchanges, so carbon dioxide is building up in our body, that's going to lead to more acid production and a drop in pH. This is why if you end up with inability to respire properly, you can typically end up with blood acidosis, because an increase in retention of the carbon dioxide in your bloodstream leads to an acidic bloodstream. So you end up with blood acidosis. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the acid-base balance. Okay, anytime that we see one of these feedback loops, you want to first think about the controlled condition that we are disrupting. So we have some sort of stimulus that comes in and disrupts homeostasis. How does it do that? Well, in this case, the controlled condition is blood pH, and it is disrupted by increasing the hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, so what happens when we increase the hydrogen ion concentration? We decrease the blood pH, right? Okay, now keep in mind that no matter what it is that we want to work with in terms of homeostasis, our body is going to have something that regulates it. So we have these chemoreceptors, so chemical receptors, and then they're found in a lot of different regions, but the ones that we're talking about here, these peripheral chemoreceptors, these chemoreceptors are found in the aortic arch, and then also in the carotid bodies. And these are going to help detect the blood chemistry, including the blood pH. We also have receptors in the medulla oblongata in the brain. Both of these are going to respond to that blood pH. Again, it's going to be a blood pH decrease. I know it says increase in hydrogen ion concentration, but that results in a decrease in blood pH. And then that is going to lead to some sort of response to some center. In this case, it's the control center in the medulla oblongata that's responsible for respiration. So the dorsal respiratory group in the medulla oblongata is going to respond to this low pH. Well, it's going to respond to what the central chemoreceptors have told it to do because of the low pH. And it's going to have effectors that are going to fire on the diaphragm. The diaphragm is going to increase contraction. It's going to increase more forcefully and also more frequently. That means we're going to exhale more carbon dioxide. The more carbon dioxide that is exhaled, the less bicarbonate is in the system available, right? And that means that we're going to have less hydrogen ions present. If we have less hydrogen ions present, our blood pH is going to increase, which is going to restore homeostatic conditions, because again, our response has brought whatever it is, in this case blood pH, back to normal. Okay, and again, you can look at this either as blood pH or as hydrogen ion concentration, so don't let that trick you when it comes to an exam. If we're looking at an increase in hydrogen ions, we are looking at a decrease in pH, right, and vice versa. So just kind of keep that in mind, that it's an inverse relationship there. Okay, how else do we maintain our acid-base balance? Well, our kidneys are very important with that. I know we just talked about our renal lecture. The kidneys are going to excrete the hydrogen ions, and excretion of hydrogen in the urine is going to help remove non-volatile acids, right? Because hydrogen is going to help bond to these and pull them out of the body. And we're all going to do that in the convoluted tubules, right? The proximal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts of the kidneys are going to be secreting hydrogen ions into the tubular fluid. All right, and how does that work? So again, for those of you that have seen my kidney lecture, this should look very familiar to you. This side is the urine, this side is going to be the interstitial fluid, this is the blood capillary. This is what's called an intercalated cell, so it's tightly connected to the cell next to it in the collecting duct, so a lot of things don't get through, including water. However, one thing that is going to be allowed through here is going to be protons, including the hydrogen ion. So the hydrogen ion is going to get pumped through. This is going to be active transport. You can tell it's active because this is an ATP molecule here being converted into a DP molecule. Again, that's going to be a release of energy or an exergonic reaction, which is going to help drive this hydrogen ion across the concentration gradient into the urine. Okay, at the same time, we have what's called an antiporter. There's also symporters. Antiporters mean that one molecule is going this direction and the other molecule is going that direction. A symporter would mean they were both going in the same direction. But here we have a bicarbonate molecule, antiporter. So the bicarbonate is going to be pumped out, so then it can end up being picked back up into the blood supply. At the same time, the chloride molecule is going to get pumped in through the same antiporter molecule. All right. So some of the hydrogen that's going to get secreted into the tubular fluid is going to get buffered. And these buffers are going to be excreted out in the urine along with the hydrogen. So this here H2PO4 negative is going to get secreted out. NH4 positive, you might recognize that, right? Uric acid, that's going to be secreted out as well. All right. So there are multiple different mechanisms that are going to maintain the pH of these body fluids. One is that buffer system, several different sets of buffer systems that we talked about, right? We talked about the protein buffer system, the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, the phosphates buffer system. Also the exhalation of carbon dioxide, so the respiratory system is going to be involved in the maintenance of pH, and last but not least the kidneys, which are going to be secreting the hydrogen into the urine. So this is basically summarizing the past, 8 to 10 slides. So what happens if we end up with an acid-base imbalance? And as again I mentioned, you're trying to stay between 7.35 and 7.45. You end up below 7.35, that's called blood acidosis. If you end up above 7.45, that's called blood alkalosis. Now this can happen one of two major ways. One is through errors in respiration, and one is through errors in metabolism. So if we have issues with respiration, that can lead to either respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis, which is that when the blood pH is going to change based on either excessive retention of carbon dioxide, which leads to an increase in H2CO3, or we can end up with an alkalosis because of respiration, where the blood pH is going to increase. Again, anytime you say alkalosis, it's an increase in pH, and that's going to happen because of extensive loss of carbon dioxide. And this can occur, for example, if you hyperventilate, right? So if you have an increase in gas exchange at a much higher rate, so you're losing carbon dioxide. If it occurs through errors in metabolism, then you can end up with metabolic acidosis, and that's going to be when your arterial blood levels of bicarbonate are going to fall. If we just don't have enough bicarbonate and the system is going to get overwhelmed, then we are just not going to be able to handle an increase in H or H plus, right, hydrogen ions, and that's going to lead to acidosis, right? The more hydrogen ions, the lower the pH, or the more acidic the blood. If the reverse is true, we have a much higher bicarbonate in our system than we need, then we can end up absorbing too many of those hydrogen ions out of solution. That will put us more towards alkalosis or a blood pH that is too high, right? And then this is just kind of summarizing what I just told you. So again, we can have acidosis or alkalosis. So we have a pH that is too low for acidosis and too high for alkalosis, and that can happen from two different ways: by respiration or by errors in metabolism, which lead to either too little or too low bicarbonate. And here are some of the common causes of respiratory acidosis. Basically, respiratory acidosis ends up happening generally because you're breathing too little. Hypoventilation. That can happen because of emphysema. So you're breathing normally, but you're not getting enough oxygen into your system. You're not getting enough carbon dioxide out of your system. And so you're going to end up with too much carbon dioxide in your system. So you have an increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and that's also going to lead to a decreased pH if we're not compensating at all. This is why people with emphysema are going to need to have exogenous oxygen. We can also have respiratory alkalosis. Again, this happens if you have too low carbon dioxide, if you have been hyperventilating, for example. But we can also have issues that occur with our brain chemistry. So if you have a cerebrovascular accident, for example, or anxiety, you can end up with issues with alkalosis as well, because our brain chemistry is also responsible for the pH at some level. Some compensatory mechanisms generally are going to be the renal pathway, because the problem already is respiration. So we want to compensate by an alternate pathway, whereas you might notice with metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, the compensatory mechanism is respiratory mechanism. But with the respiratory acidosis, the compensatory mechanism is renal. So if we want to get rid of our hydrogen ions because we have acidosis, which means we have too much hydrogen, then we're going to increase the excretion of hydrogen ions through our kidneys and increase the resorption of bicarbonate also through our kidneys. Okay? With respiratory alkalosis, we're going to do the opposite. Again, we're going to be using our kidneys, but we're going to be decreasing the excretion of hydrogen ions, and that's also going to be decreasing the resorption of bicarbonate. So this is going to be kind of a compensatory mechanism if we're having issues with respiration. This won't necessarily help us with gas exchange, but it will help us with blood pH. If, however, we have issues with our metabolism because of too much or too little bicarbonate in our system, which leads to, so decreased bicarbonate leads to decreased pH, increased bicarbonate leads to increased pH because we're pulling more hydrogen ions out of solution, which means we're getting more basic. Anyway, either one of those is going to be compensated for by respiratory compensation, generally by hyper or hypoventilation, right? Breathing much more quickly or breathing much more slowly, which is going to help change the amount of carbon dioxide that is lost to the atmosphere. All right, so what happens as you age? So there are some differences between adults and infants in a lot of different factors, including the fluid distribution, also basically how much fluid is in their body and how much of that fluid is inside their cells versus their extracellular fluid, and then regulation of fluid and electrolyte balance, also acid-base homeostasis. And again, these differences are mainly going to exist due to the differences in the proportion and the distribution of the water in their body. We also are going to have changes in metabolic rate as we get older, right? Our metabolism is going to slow down. Our kidneys are going to become less functional as we get older. Additionally, when we're younger, we have less functional development of the kidneys, which is why if they're exposed to toxins like alcohol, etc., when they're much younger, it can cause severe damage later on in life, or kidney infections from urinary tract infections, etc. Also differences in the body surface area, breathing rate, ion concentrations, etc. So older adults generally are going to have a decreased ability to have proper acid-base balance, to maintain their fluid compositions and their electrolyte balances. So basically everything is going to start functioning a little bit less efficiently as they get older. And so they're often going to suffer from dehydration. They're just not getting enough fluid into their body because they might have issues with their thirst reflex, or they might just be older and getting up is kind of a pain in the butt, and so they might wait. They also sometimes tend to have issues with hypernatremia, so that's going to be you're going to have an increase of sodium because we have had less fluid coming in. And then also they've lost more water than the sodium, so they're going to end up with an increase of sodium in their body. They also sometimes end up with hypokalemia, or a decrease in the potassium in their body. Oftentimes this happens because they take a lot of different medications, either over the counter or for different chronic illnesses, and oftentimes that's going to include different types of laxatives, which can lead to loss of potassium. So some of the issues that can happen, again, acidosis is when we're going to end up with a increase in the hydrogen ions in solution and therefore a decrease in the blood pH. And that can impair the ability of the lungs and the kidneys, or it can be because we have an impaired ability of the lungs and the kidneys to compensate for whatever little imbalances have gone wrong. So that, guys, brings me to the end of my lecture. So I appreciate you listening to me drone on, and I will talk to you guys next time with another lecture shortly. You guys have a great day.